morning, everyone. We've got computers that say 8:59 and 9 o'clock and 9:01, so we're going to go with Verizon, which says 9:01. So we will call to order this board meeting. As has been a tradition for some time, I will start by reading our mission statement, which is to promote, preserve, and protect public health, safety, and welfare by fostering the provision of quality pharmaceutical care to the citizens of Texas through the regulation of the practice of pharmacy, the operation of pharmacies, and the distribution of prescription drugs in the public interest. We'll go ahead and start with just a few announcements. First of all, we cannot have any food in this room, so just if you'll abide by that. There are QR codes for Wi-Fi, and they're posted around the room, so you'll want to use that if you need it. Room 102, which is kind of just catty corner and across the lobby, has been set up for an overflow if you don't feel comfortable, here. And the meeting is streaming in there, and also there are masks available. There is CE for today. It'll be counted as Texas-specific law or as a general credit. As usual, you do need to be here for the whole meeting. But unlike other meetings, there's not a sign-on, so at the end, you will scan a QR code, and that will record your attendance. The other thing is, it is now November the 2nd, which hard to believe the year has gone by so fast. But I did want to recognize last month as National Pharmacy Month. Hopefully you saw the thanks that went out to all of our pharmacists and all of our technicians for the absolutely heroic job that they have done through the pandemic. When you look at the amount of people that have been immunized, whether it's the full series or boosters, every time that a new booster comes out or a new age group's included, pharmacy has stepped up to the plate to be part of that healthcare team, to be part of the answer. So, kudos and huge thanks to all of our pharmacists and technicians that are out there and the job that they've done, and also to our staff. Our staff has done an exceedingly great job working from home as well as in the office, and all they have done to make sure that we didn't miss a beat. And it's without our staff, we really would struggle. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim so that we can do a roll call.
Thank you very much, Madam President. President Julie Spear.
Here.
Vice President Lori Hinkey.
Here.
Treasurer Rick Fernandez. Here. Board Member Jimmy Oakham.
Here.
Board Member Bradley Miller.
Here.
Board Member Daniel Guerrero. Here. Board Member Donna Montemor.
Here.
Board Member Rick Tisch.
Here.
Board Member Suzette Chirina.
Here.
Board Member Don Lewis.
Here.
And Board Member Chip Thornsberg is not here today. Madam President, you have a form.
Thank you. We do want to recognize that this is Chip's last meeting, and he regretted that he could not attend. But as a board, we want to formally thank him for the service that he's provided to this board. He has always been a great resource, a person to ask very intelligent questions during his time, and we've really benefited from having him on the board, and we're sorry that he's not going to continue this appointment. So with that, next on the agenda is the discussion and approval of minutes. As always, board, you have had a chance to review these minutes. I need to find if there are any corrections that need to be made, and if not, I have a motion to approve.
Motion to approve. Second.
Daniel Guerrero has made the motion to approve. Donnie Lewis is second. All those in favor of approval of minutes?
Aye.
Any opposed? The minutes then pass. With that, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to our public comments first. I do want to kind of give a little bit of instruction, and that is that each person will have 3 minutes to speak. We do want to make sure that, as in previous live meetings, that if your comments have discussed said that you simply come to the podium and say that you agree with the other person rather than reiterating the same information all over again. People that have signed up have already done so, but one of the things that we want to go ahead and do additionally is as you come to the podium, if you will, there's a list there, go ahead and sign in again so that we have a good reference that you were here and that you did speak. So with that, our first public speaker will be Ross Caputo. If you'll come to the podium.
Hi there, good morning. My name is Ross Caputo, and for those of you that don't know me, I am the President and CEO of Eagle Analytical Testing Laboratory in Houston, Texas, where we do GMP surveys, hospital inspections, FDA inspections, pharmacy inspections, and we have probably inspected about 1,000 compounding pharmacies. And I wanted to commend the board on the work that they were doing, and I want to point out 3 things. In the last 6 weeks, I've been to inspections for non-sterile operations here in Texas with the FDA and some board members, inspectors here as well. They are all over the activity of insanitary guidelines for non-sterile activity. They were written up for dirt in vents of the non-sterile area, not in clean rooms, not in HEPA filters, not whatever. And the comment was, how do you protect patient safety from dust that could go down from a vent and get into a product? I said it only because it's real, and I want you to know that. So just know that that's real. Number 2, potency tests. We're going to put on the Eagle website a 10-year data mining test that talks about potency, of which 15.6% of all products fail potency. That's 1,000 data points over a 10-year time period. I applaud you for the start of saying that you're going to test 3 potency tests in a year. Good start. It's not money, but remember that you can't test quality into a product, that you need to process it, make sure it happens. And frankly, to do any powder testing without a powder hood, without reason, I don't know how to argue that that doesn't make any sense to me. But thank you very much.
Next, we'll have Debbie Garza.
Good morning. I'm Debbie Garza, the CEO of the Texas Pharmacy Association, and I'm here today to offer comments on behalf of the Texas Pharmacy Association. We also provided written comments to you in your board materials as well, so I won't go into all those details. But I just want to let you know that TPA does not support the proposed non-sterile compounding rules as published in the register and does not believe they should be adopted as written. Pharmacists have been compounding medications since the beginning of time, and we have performed non-sterile compounding safely and effectively for many years. While we totally understand and support the need for sterile compounding rules, we feel that similar rules are not necessary for non-sterile compounding. The proposed rules as written are overly prescriptive and overreaching. We feel the rules in the current pharmacy regulations adequately address non-sterile compounding. The proposed additional rules will cause confusion and significantly reduce patient access to much needed non-sterile compounded preparations. Many pharmacies will likely be unable or unwilling to meet the new requirements and therefore be unable to meet their patients' medication needs. We believe that the proposed rules as written are onerous for more less difficult, less complex non-sterile compounding and are definitely not required for flavoring. We appreciate the Compounding Advisory Group's hard work and expertise. We ask the board members and the advisory group to look at compounding through the eyes of many pharmacists whose core business is not compounding, and ask them to consider the unintended consequences such rules can have on patient access to care by limiting the ability for such pharmacists to compound needed medications. Texas already has solid rules for non-sterile compounding in the current pharmacy regulations. Perhaps the advisory group of the board should look at best practices and tips to help board inspectors when inspecting pharmacies and enforcing current rules. So we respectfully ask the board to vote no and not adopt these rules as written. Happy to answer any questions.
Next is Sabrina Griggs from
Good morning. I have no problem with the regulation of our industry, and I fully agree that all compounding should be done with proper equipment and with adequate PPE to produce a quality product while protecting the health of both our patients and our staff. However, the proposed regulations regarding training go far beyond this goal. Before implementing training requirements, adequate and accessible online training should be made available. Both our technicians are single moms. They're not able to travel away from home for the 40 hours of live training. Even the CE requirements, there's no one out there doing CE for compounding. Granted, they're CE, but for compounding. And those of us that are not PCCA members, it puts even in a bigger bind. In our case, myself, I don't actually compound. I supervise my technicians, I do lab reviews, I check logs, I build formulas, but I'm not under the hood compounding. I'm making sure the technicians do what they're supposed to do and do it correctly. Such personnel not involved in hands-on compounding should not be included in product testing requirements. The product testing requirements is going to be a huge financial burden. You know, we're looking at a minimum of $150 per item that's sent in, and it could go higher than that depending on what your components are. That needs to be addressed. Testing different products annually, if we're going to test maybe over a 2-year period, same with the CE. You know, the CE in there says you need the CE every year, maybe in a 2-year period. There's just so many things that I think that we need to talk about, look at. Talk to the small town pharmacies and see what works for everybody. I believe that this will create a burdensome regulatory environment and will result in the loss of a lot of our small town compounding pharmacies, and ultimately limit patient access in the small towns. You know, not everyone can drive to the big town to get their drugs made. And growing up in the Panhandle, that was even more evident. But you know, I'm in the hill country, but I still have people driving in from Lakey, from Rock Springs and such to get their medications. And you know, that's an hour and a half, 2-hour drive. And what would happen if I wasn't there? So I appreciate your time, and I just would appreciate more overview on these regulations that were presented. And I appreciate the compounding committee's time, because I've served on a committee, and I know that it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and being away from your store. But I just believe that it needs a bigger overview than everything that's presented. Thank you very much.
Now, Jeff Carson from Oakdale Compound.
Morning. Where we start today is on the same page with regards to patient safety and quality care. And where we need to end today is also on the same page for the good of the profession, for the good of lawmakers that are seeking solutions with regards to compounding, and ultimately for the good of our patients. We currently lack the necessary foundational rules to ensure compliance with best practices. Today, non-sterile compounding is evolving faster than any static words in a rule book. They can now cause real harm. Talk to the multiple patients that were recently hospitalized with thyrotoxicosis because their pharmacy made their sustained release capsules 96,000% super potent. Or talk to the pharmacist that was hospitalized with superhuman levels of steroid hormones in her body due to exposure to airborne powders because she didn't compound in a powder hood. If we don't take back control of our profession and self-police it, it will be done for us. Talk about lack. The FDA, misguided lawmakers, OSHA, and others are attempting to overregulate us out of the industry completely. Static words in the book are not the answer, in my opinion. We desperately need to establish a formal peer review process that allows pharmacists to hold pharmacists accountable to best practices. This is best done with a limited number of specific rules in the law that establish fundamental basics and standards while referring the individual expression of compounding to a peer review process that evolves at the same pace as modern-day compounding. These proposed rules allow us to take back control of our profession, utilizing peer review, and thus reducing the need for others to control us. I do not believe in adding more regulations. In fact, I believe in decreasing or even deleting references to the USP compounding chapters. The USP was never meant to be the law. Its purpose is to create standards that others can refer to and use in the establishment of best practices. They are to influence, USP is there to influence and guide us in our profession through the establishment of best practices, not to regulate it. It is our unique and individual expression of these standards that we should be judged upon. And what we need right now in Texas is fundamental requirements for everyone who wants to engage in modern-day compounding. These rules do just that. If you think that these rules are going to prevent a pharmacy from making diaper rash ointment, magic mouthwash, or prevent pharmacies from using commercially available flavoring agents, then you're wrong. We interacted with the board inspectors on the task force continually. These are not going to be used as gotcha rules. These rules are important in creating fundamental, basic requirements for complex compounding. They will give the inspectors the tools necessary to protect people from pharmacies who are not practicing at the required minimum level of best practices. It's about bringing everyone engaged in compounding up to a new level of excellence. How many times have each of us in this room been encouraged by our respective board inspector to improve our pharmacy operations? How many times have each of our respective board inspectors worked with us to be better than we were before they came in? In closing, static words in the book are and should be just the basic fundamentals that we should all follow. Additional training in the testing of any 3 products, these are just basics. If we vote these changes down today, we could be delaying them indefinitely as we try to wordsmith our way to perfection. We know these aren't perfect, but they are solid and their intent is noble and correct. It took years to get to this point. Remember the words of General George Patton. A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan never realized. Help us take back control of our profession. It is time to execute a good plan. Thank you.
Chad Baker from Flavor RX.
Hello, my name is Chad Baker. I'm the Senior Vice President at Flavor RX, a supplier of medicine flavoring technology to over 3,000 pharmacies in the state of Texas and 40,000 pharmacies across the country. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you this morning. While I know the board has more issues to consider here today than just the simple flavoring of children's medicines, that is my singular purpose for appearing before you. I am not here this morning to convince you that flavoring medicine is not compounding. Frankly, it doesn't matter what you call it. What does matter is how you treat it. For the past 14 years, the Texas State Board of Pharmacy has allowed pharmacists to customize the taste of children's medicine, of commonly dispensed children's liquid medications like amoxicillin, clindamycin, and Tamiflu at the behest of the parent or the child's caregiver without subjecting the practice to non-sterile compounding requirements. This is done with the sole intent of helping children take their medicine and reducing stress for the whole family when kids are sick. We estimate that since the Texas State Board of Pharmacy adopted its pragmatic approach to flavoring medicines back in 2007, 15 million children in Texas, from Amarillo to El Paso, Brownsville to Longview, and everywhere nearby and in between, have benefited from this valuable pharmacy service without, to my knowledge, a single reported incident of harm. That's 1 million kids each year in Texas benefiting from having their medicines safely flavored in chain, independent, hospital pharmacies located in cities, towns, and communities all over the state. If you decide today, or at some future date, to put flavoring of medicines on the non-sterile compounding side of the line in the sand, access to this core pharmacy service that parents have come to rely upon to make life easier for them and their children simply goes away. Most pharmacies will cease offering the service to their patients in lieu of spending so much time and money to get classified as a non-sterile compounding pharmacy, just so they can simply take a few seconds to make a child's medicine taste better. For the 1 million kids in Texas that get their medicines custom flavored every year, they will be left to do battle with their parents come medicine time, or their parents will experiment with home-cooked remedies to help get the medicine down, or those children simply will not take their medicine. That cannot possibly be the intent of the board. The fact is, flavoring can be done without the stability, can be done without impacting the stability or potency of medications. Flavoring can be done without impacting the pH of medications. We test our flavors to ensure they are inert, do not impact how medications work. Flavoring can also be done uniformly. In fact, pharmacies in Texas, more than any other state, have adopted automated technology to dispense precise amounts of flavors into medications at the push of a button. Flavoring medications can be done safely and is being done safely right now, every day in pharmacies across Texas. But it can barely be done at all if the practice is subjected to the burdensome non-sterile compounding requirements you are being asked to approve today. For that reason, I urge you to vote no on adopting these new rules. Thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Next, we'll hear from Raymond Solano. Raymond Solano from Prescription Dispensing Lab. Does not appear that he's here. We will move to Ben Sims from Berkshire Grocery.
Good morning. My name is Ben Sims. I'm with Berkshire Grocery Company, and there's not a lot more I can say other than what Debbie has already said and the gentleman from Flavor RX. With the rules as written, it would prevent Berkshire Grocery Company from continuing the process of compounding basic compound prescriptions. As the rules are written, it would prevent our pharmacists from trying these basic compounds like added flavors or mixing two creams together, triamcinolone and urea, just basic compounds like that. BGC services many rural communities that provide customers a one-stop shop to fulfill their families' prescription needs as well as picking up groceries and doing other things in the store. These rural areas will be greatly affected and by not being able to prepare these less complex, non-sterile compounds in our pharmacies. Patients will have to go elsewhere, which would limit their patient care and be a delay in critical therapy.
Next we'll hear from Brady Shemek from Berkshire Brothers.
Good morning. My name is Brady Shimmick. I'm a pharmacy district director with Berkshire Brothers Pharmacy. I'm also a practicing pharmacist. On behalf of Berkshire Brothers and TFDS, I would like to extend our gratitude to the board's continued work during this ongoing pandemic, as well as the continued efforts to increase patient safety. I also appreciate the opportunity to speak before you today. I'm here to submit Berkshire Brothers' opposition to the proposed rules under 291.36 and 291.131 regarding non-sterile compounding. As a retail pharmacy chain with 67 locations across many rural areas in the central, east, and southeast Texas, we believe we play a crucial role in providing pharmacy access to many underserved areas. The non-sterile compounding rules that are being proposed would severely diminish our ability to fully serve these areas. Elimination of our ability to complete common, simple, non-sterile compounds, increased costs for needs to remodel, and added testing and newly required space that is simply not available would ultimately lead to our compounding services no longer being offered at our pharmacies. While non-sterile compounding is only a small part of our pharmacy's role in providing care, it is a substantial service that we provide to ensure patient access is not limited in these underserved areas. Many of our pharmacies are the only pharmacy for 15 to 20 miles. Sometimes the nearest pharmacy is another Berkshire Brothers or a pharmacy similar to ours. Like us, we believe that many of these pharmacies will also lose their ability to offer compounding services, which will limit patient access even more. How far will patients have to travel for a simple non-sterile compound like Magic Mouthwash or a diaper cream rash, or for a diaper rash cream? Or how long will patients have to wait for a simple compound to arrive in the mail? The proposed rules will ultimately lead to delayed patient care and unnecessary patient suffering. Again, I'd like to reiterate that Berkshire Brothers and TFDS opposes the proposed rules regarding non-sterile compounding, as it will diminish access to patients in need. Thank you for your time and opportunity to comment today.
Our next speaker is Janu Phillip from Walgreens.
Good morning, board members. My name is Janu Phillip, Director of Pharmacy Affairs for Walgreens. I also serve as a member of the Florida Board of Pharmacy, going on 8 years. I'm here representing Walgreens' 700 plus locations here in Texas. My comments are in relation to 2 proposed rules. The first one is 291.36. It's a new permitting requirement where pharmacies will be required to obtain a new permit type in order to participate in non-sterile compounding. There are many routine compounds that pharmacists have been combining for years with no complaints and extremely low risk of patient harm. We recommend utilizing some type of exception process to include basic or routine compounds, which we believe helps to solve the dilemma of requiring an extra license from every community pharmacy as a compounding pharmacy. One suggestion would be to consider what Mississippi did, where they exempted certain pharmacies from obtaining a compound certificate based on certain criteria, such as combining 4 or less commercially manufactured, ready-to-use products that have not been manipulated. We also believe the board's inspector's time is better served focusing on pharmacies that are performing more complex sterile and non-sterile compounding. The second rule is 291.131, which addresses the compounding of non-sterile preparations. We believe these regulations to be overly burdensome. Many of the requirements added to this section appear to come from the newly proposed USP 795 guidelines. These guidelines have been met with much opposition, and they are currently still open for public comment. We believe drafting these regulations in Texas before the proposed changes to USP 795 have become finalized is premature. There are a handful of onerous and costly requirements within these proposed rules, such as the need for personnel to complete testing of ingredients or requiring lengthy courses for pharmacists and technicians. And another requirement is to mandate the use of a closed system device instead of allowing for the use of a professional judgment regarding when such a device is needed. All of these have added costs. If accepted as written, many pharmacies may simply choose to stop compounding, and these regulations will dramatically limit patient access for both vital and simple and complex compounds alike. The board has not provided any evidence of such an extreme spike of non-sterile compounding related cases, nor evidence of why these additional requirements are necessary. We believe that the board has a responsibility to promulgate regulations using data and evidence to support any potential increase in requirements, administrative burdens, and other associated costs. We believe that the additional requirements within this rule are unnecessary from a public protection standpoint, and we recommend voting no to these proposed rules. Otherwise, I would ask the board to send both sets of these rules back to the agency and continue to engage with stakeholders to identify how to craft rules that will permit the needed access to basic compounds while still protecting the public. I appreciate the board's time and opportunity to comment. Thank you.
Next, we have Gary Cashtori.
Good morning. Before I start, let me officially welcome Dr. Timothy Tucker to Texas. I've known Dr. Tucker for a long time. I know it took him 30 years longer than me to get to Texas, so welcome, Dr. Tucker. So thank you for allowing me to comment. I know many of you know me, but for those who don't know me, my name is Gary Cacciatore. I am a pharmacist and an attorney. I recently retired as Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Cardinal Health. So I want to make clear that my comments today are my own. They don't represent my former employer,
Cardinal Health. At Cardinal Health, however, I spent 23 years working on legal and regulatory issues throughout the country, working with lots of state boards on lots of different issues. So I think I was pretty familiar. I think I still am. I just retired in July, so I think I still am pretty familiar with trends going on at other state boards of pharmacies. In addition to my work at Cardinal, I've also taught pharmacy law at the University of Houston College of Pharmacy for over 25 years. I'm also the co-author of Texas and Federal Pharmacy and Drug Law, which is the textbook that almost every pharmacy school in Texas uses. I'm also the co-author of the Ultimate Texas MPJE Review Guide, which helps pharmacists and pharmacy students get their license, actually. So I didn't submit any written comments, but I do share some of the concerns that were in a lot of the written comments and other ones you've heard today. But let me give you a little bit different perspective. As someone who teaches pharmacy law, I've been teaching pharmacy law for 25 years, I think these rules are unnecessarily complex and they're going to lead to confusion in practice. And this is not a criticism of the committee that put these rules together. I have respect for the committee, and it's a very difficult job that they have. And I think raising the standard of practice for non-sterile compounding is a very laudable goal. But I think it was clear from even the comments at the last meeting and the comments you've received today, that just a little bit of work that needs to be done if we are going to move forward with some non-sterile compounding rules. I just think the rules as written will make it difficult for pharmacists to understand what their obligations are. And I can tell you, as someone who, I've written legislation and rules in multiple states, and these rules still need additional work, I believe. My second concern with the rules is a little bit different approach, I think, is I don't think creating all these new classes of pharmacies is really the way to go. So a quick story. Prior to joining Cardinal Health 23 years ago, I was in full-time academia. I actually wrote an opinion piece that was published in the journal Pharmacotherapy. And it was entitled The Overregulation of Pharmacy Practice. In that opinion piece, I argued that unlike other professions, including medicine and even law, believe it or not, pharmacy tends to be overregulated, which leads to pharmacy actually being less of a profession. I actually remember Orrin Peacock, who was the president of the Texas board at that time, passing out my article at the board meeting. And I was a little nervous because right after that, I joined Cardinal Health and my job was to deal with regulations all the time. It took 20 years, but the points that I raised in that article are finally being picked up by the states. We're seeing a trend now in other states towards less regulation and allowing pharmacists to practice at the top of their license. And unfortunately, I think these rules kind of do the opposite of that. Texas already has some of the most complex and detailed pharmacy regulations of any state. Honestly, that's one of the reasons that my book is over 600 pages long. Adding more regulations like this, I think, it's going to make Texas almost as complex as my friend Jadu has in Florida, where Florida has 18 different licenses. We already have 11 in Texas. I don't think adding more. I know we want to compete with Florida to have the most of everything, but this is not the way to do it. Honestly, if I have any bias, I would argue for these rules because making the rules more complex and ambiguous helps me sell more of my books. So, but honestly, but my opinion is the same as it was 20 years ago. Pharmacy laws and rules need to be simple, understandable, and flexible enough to allow pharmacists to practice at the top of their license. I think rules are necessary to protect the public, but in my opinion, you can draft rules that protect the public health that are much simpler. I always found it very interesting that there are states like Virginia and several other states around the country have one permit, one type of permit, but Florida needs 18 and Texas needs 11 to protect the public health. So I would encourage you not to adopt these rules as written.
All right, next we'll hear from Arjun Day, AJ, from PCCA. Janae from HEB.
name is Janae Scheck-Snyder. I work at HEB's Hazardous Compounding Pharmacy. I agree, trying not to reiterate a lot of things that everyone said with all of the oppositions thus far. Fortunately, I am a member of the Compound Advisory Group, and one of the main things that I want to say is our overall agenda was to increase the regulation but not decrease the patient access. And I think these rules as written would do that for our patients and our public health, and we don't want that. I suggest that the proposed changes are not be adopted and given back to the board staff for review. And I'll just add, in regard to flavoring, I agree with everything that Chad said, and I can add personal testament to that. My oldest son, Chase, when we go to HEB to pick up our prescriptions, he's like, did they make a cupcake on me? Is it cupcake? So bubblegum is cupcake. They don't actually have a cupcake flavor, but that's what he thinks it is. But if I say it's cupcake, he's all for it. He's gonna take it. And not being able to do that, I know he is my strong-willed child. I will have a problem getting him to take those medications. And I can imagine, I've received those phone calls from parents as a pharmacist professionally saying, thank you so much. My child takes this medication now. You know, you flavored this, and whatever you did, keep doing it for next time. So removing that would severely decrease the adherence for our pediatric population, and we don't want to do that. They already don't want to take medication, so if we take away the access to flavoring to make it better for them, well, they'll lose that even more. The dedicated workspace. Now, I lost out on some of this in the board group. I do think we need a dedicated workspace. I don't think you should be compounding on the counter where you're eating your pizza. I don't think that if you're using the first progesterone vaginal suppository kit and you microwave it in the microwave that you just had your tuna sandwich in, I don't think those things go together. But I think that requiring every pharmacy to have a hood and not going stricter than what USP 795 and USP 800 require is onerous, it's burdensome, it's going to decrease the amount of pharmacies available to our patients and decrease the amount of access that we have to these compounded prescriptions. Every compound prescription is not urgent, but some of them are. And we hear that as a pharmacist in testament to the parents that are calling and like, I need this tomorrow, I need this urgently, can you get this out to me? I dropped my bottle, I don't have any more, can you get it to me? So if we decrease the access that patients have to that, what do they do in their emergency when they don't have any more? Or you have a medication that needs to be tapered and you can't cut it off completely. What do we do now that they have to drive? Like, I think it was, I don't remember her name, but she came up and she lives in the Panhandle. So what do you do when you have to drive 3 hours to get to that because you've now cut out 5 of the 10 pharmacies that they had access to? The current changes as they are written should not be accepted. I think that there needs to be some more work. I think the wording has been interpreted differently than what we as a compound advisory group intended. And then lastly, I'll just end with the training requirements. There is not as much training, CE, and options available for non-sterile as there is for sterile. So asking for technicians and pharmacists to have the same amount of training for non-sterile versus sterile isn't comparable because there's so much more that goes into sterile training than non-sterile training. So I think it was good asking for CE, yes. I think asking for training is good, yes. But I also think the way this has it written, that the pharmacy itself can create their own training program is the best way to go with that. Not forcing pharmacies to have 40 hours of ACPE accredited non-sterile training. And lastly, thank you for your time and the opportunity to speak again. And again, I think that these changes should not be proposed as written.
Our next speaker is Lisa Smith from the Group of Independent Compounding Pharmacies. It does not appear that Lisa is here. All right, next we have Jeff Lush from Kroger's TSBP.
Good morning. My name is Jeff Lush. I'm the Director of Pharmacy for Kroger's Dallas Division. I'm also the President of the Texas Federation of Drugstores, and I'm providing comments this morning on both. The current proposal before the board on non-sterile compounding creates several concerns and barriers for pharmacies that could lead to significant access issues for patients and delays in treatment. Specifically, I'd like to speak to the proposed training requirements. Under the current proposal, a pharmacy that compounds less than 20 compounds in its master formulation record, even if all similar and relatively simple in process and difficulty, is subject to the same minimum training requirements as a pharmacy that compounds several hundred medications involving far more complex compounding processes, along with the use of multiple pieces of specialized equipment that each require their own training on use and sanitation. While training in proper compounding is a necessity, a one-size-fits-all approach to minimum training for compounding may not adequately address complex situations and may overcomplicate and create barriers that limit access in less complicated situations. The specified amount of training of 20 hours for pharmacists and 40 hours for technicians creates an unnecessary barrier for many pharmacies that only provide a limited number of simple and moderate compounds. These barriers will prevent pharmacists from providing care for patients and will limit patient access to these medications and potentially delay treatment. Additionally, the specified training requirements exceed the current proposed updates to USP 795 that have been approved by USP's compounding committee. If passed in their current form, these regulations would have the unintended consequence of causing many pharmacies to either discontinuing offering even simple and moderate compounds to patients, or to centralize compounding to a facility that would mail the compound to patients. The former option is the most likely outcome for us as a company. The simple and moderate levels of compounding that are prepared in our pharmacies today are of a significantly lower level of risk than complex compounding and have been performed with a very high degree of safety by patients in all pharmacies for many decades. By handling all non-sterile compounding identically, this also does not give the board's inspectors the tools necessary to identify and differentiate between potential concerns with simple to moderate compounding versus complex compounding. For these reasons, I urge the board members to vote no to the proposal before the board today, or to send the proposal back to the agency staff. Thank you for the opportunity to provide comments today.
Thank you. And then our last speaker is Teresa Billings from TSBP.
Good morning. My name is Teresa Billings, and I'm here to represent the Texas Society of Health System Pharmacy. I agree with several of the comments that's been made so far, and I want to take this time to discuss some of those rules for the D.1.3 and D.1.3 TSHP, we submitted a more comprehensive and extensive written comments to the proposed rules and amendments that were published in the register. But I wanted to reiterate a couple of the overall concerns regarding the proposed rules. TSHP believes that the proposed rules amendments would have a significant negative impact on Class C pharmacies, and the extent of impact will go well beyond the stated influence, both in the number of Class C pharmacies that are impacted as well as the economic impact of those pharmacies. These changes, as proposed, will likely lead to an increase in the cost of patient care, and especially in our rural areas. We respectfully ask that the board postpone any proposed rule amendments to the Class C non-sterile compounding rules until the board can gather additional information regarding the impact of those rules, weighing the impact that is demonstrated improvements in patient safety, as well as to allow for changes to USP 795 standards to actually be implemented. So at this time, I thank you for your time and consideration of this thoughts put forth, and I welcome any questions if you have any. Thank you.
All right, this concludes our public comments. And with that, we will go to, I'll turn it over to John for the beginning of final adoption of rules.
Good morning, board members. In your rule PDFs, there are bookmarks to the links with lines with edits. Also, for the rules that are up for adoption, you have received copies of the orders and preambles in the OneDrive link that was sent to you. You also have them on your computers in front of you. Let's start with the rules for adoption. All the rules up for adoption were proposed at the August 3rd, 2021 board meeting, and they were published in the September 24th, 2021 issue of the Texas Register. The first one, D.1.1, amendments concerning licenses and registrations for military service members, military veterans, and military spouses. D.1.1.1, amendments to 283.12 concerning pharmacists. This change, along with the change for technicians, is required by House Bill 139 in this past legislative session. It simply updates the required documentation for a military spouse to receive an interim license or registration. On line 51 rule, you will see updates to the definition to include the Space Force branch of service. And on line 174, it updates the documentation required for a military spouse to obtain an interim pharmacist license to include a copy of the permanent change of station order or the military service member to whom the spouse is married. Moving to D.1.1.2, these are amendments to 297.10 concerning technicians. And it's the same rationale as for the pharmacist is required by the legislature. Line 53, again, updates the definition to include the Space Force branch of service. And line 133 updates the documentation required for a military spouse to obtain an intern technician registration to include a copy of the permanent change of station order for the military service member to whom the spouse is married. We did not receive any comments on these rules.
All right, we will take these together. Are there any questions, comments? And if not, we have a motion to adopt. Don Mummer has made a motion to adopt. Bradley Miller has made a second. All those in favor of adoption of these rules, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Next, moving on to D.1.2. These are amendments to 291.34 concerning emergency refill of insulin or insulin-related equipment or supplies. The impetus for this change comes from House Bill 1935 in this past legislative session. It allows a pharmacist, while exercising the pharmacist's professional judgment, to provide an emergency refill of insulin or insulin-related equipment or supplies under certain conditions. In line 386 lists the requirements from the statute itself that a pharmacist must comply with before providing an emergency refill. A pharmacist may exercise the pharmacist's professional judgment in refilling a prescription for insulin or insulin-related equipment or supplies without the authorization of the prescribing practitioner if the pharmacist, 1, is unable to contact the practitioner after a reasonable effort, 2, is provided with documentation showing that the patient was previously prescribed insulin or insulin-related equipment or supplies by a practitioner, 3, assesses the patient to determine whether the emergency refill is appropriate, 4, creates a record that documents the patient's visit that includes a notation describing the documentation the patient provided, and 5, makes a reasonable attempt to inform the practitioner of the emergency refill at the earliest reasonable time. Quantity of emergency refill of insulin may not exceed a 30-day supply. The quantity of emergency refill of insulin-related equipment or supplies may not exceed the lesser of a 30-day supply or the smallest available package. And that's a requirement provided by the statute. Now, the board did receive a comment from Craig Chapman, a pharmacist at Maubang Family Pharmacy, support of the amendments. We're also suggesting a revision to the amendments to allow insulin to be provided in the smallest available package, as the amendments allow for insulin-related equipment or supplies. In order to make that change, board members, you would have to have a legislative change that would be required to Section 562.0541D of the Texas Pharmacy Act. The rule that's up for adoption today simply mirrors the statute.
Thank you, Don. Any questions or discussion?
There we go. Well, I understand that we have to, this is legislatively, we have to enact this rule based on the legislation, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, I just want to make sure it's documented. I am some concerned that some of the smallest packages need more than 30
are legislatively mandated on this. And we are gonna need a motion to adopt.
I'll go ahead and make the motion to adopt as presented.
Got it. The motion has been made by Daniel Guerrero to adopt and seconded by Lori Hinkey. All those in favor of the adoption of this rule, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? All right. So I do believe that we are coming on the top of an hour almost, 50 minutes from there. And I believe that our next topic will take some time and discussion. So I would suggest we take a, say, a 15-minute break and come back at 10:05. And that way we'll go ahead and start with our non-compounding, or our non-sterile compounding. try to speak into them a little bit more. They said yours is great, though.
Very good.
With that, we'll call the meeting back to order, and I will turn it back over to John.
All right, board members, we're looking now at D.1.3. D.1.3.1, these are amendments to 291-36 concerning community pharmacies or Class A's. And these amendments are being suggested on the recommendation of the board's compounding advisory group. And what this and the subsequent amendments propose is the creation of two new classes of pharmacies. A Class AN, which performs non-sterile compounding, and a Class ASN, which performs both sterile and non-sterile compounding. The licensing requirements of Class A have not changed. Looking at line 57, it requires the Class AS pharmacies to comply with the standard required notifications, closing procedures, and pharmacy license fee requirements. This change just makes the rule more concise and keeps us from having to modify this rule every time we have a change. Line 79 removes the Class AS requirements that they comply with 291-131 regarding pharmacies compounding non-sterile preparations, because now a Class AS only does sterile compounding, not non-sterile. Line 89 has the licensing requirements for Class AN, a community pharmacy engaged in the compounding of non-sterile preparations that use bulk API or excipients or manipulation beyond the FDA labeling of a commercial product, such as crushing a tablet or opening a capsule. And this here is the line in the sand the compounding advisory group came up with, and you'll hear that referred to multiple times today. They have the same licensing requirements also as under 291-131 for compounding non-sterile preparations. And on line 114, you have licensing requirements for Class ASNs, community pharmacy engaged in both the compounding of sterile preparations and non-sterile preparations that use bulk API or excipients, or manipulation beyond the FDA labeling of a commercial product, such as crushing a tablet or opening a capsule. Here again, we see the line in the sand. And that is the same licensing requirements under 291-131 and 291-133 because they will have both sterile and non-sterile compounding. Also, you see some formatting and grammatical corrections throughout. Moving to D.1.3.2, these are amendments to 291-77 concerning institutional pharmacy, Class C. What this and the subsequent amendments accomplish is the creation of two new classes of pharmacies, a Class CN, which performs non-sterile compounding, and a Class CSN, which performs both sterile and non-sterile compounding. The licensing requirements otherwise of Class C have not changed. As with the previous, these amendments are being suggested based on the recommendation of the board's compounding advisory group. Line 58 requires Class CS pharmacies to comply with the standard required notifications, closing procedures, and pharmacy license fee requirements. This change makes the rule more concise and keeps us from having to modify the rule every time we have a change. Line 86 requires a Class CS to comply with 291-133 regarding sterile compounding. Line 88 removes the Class CS that they comply with 291-131 regarding pharmacies compounding non-sterile preparations, because we now have a Class CS only doing sterile compounding, not non-sterile. And on line 102, it simplifies the rule by referencing the application and the information specified in that, thus removing the listed information in the rule regarding tech duties at a Class CS pharmacy. And line 121 simplifies the rule by making the same change, referencing the application for technician duties at a rural hospital. On line 144 are the licensing requirements for the Class CN, an institutional or ASC pharmacy engaged in the compounding of non-sterile preparations that use bulk API or excipients or manipulation beyond the FDA labeling of a commercial product, such as crushing a tablet or opening a capsule. Here again, we see the line in the sand. And they have the same licensing requirements under 291-131 for compounding non-sterile preparations. And finally, on line 191, you have licensing requirements for the Class CSN, an institutional or ASC pharmacy engaged in both the compounding of sterile preparations and non-sterile preparations that use bulk API or excipients or manipulation beyond the FDA labeling of a commercial product, such as crushing a tablet or opening a capsule. And they have the same licensing requirements under 291-131 and 291-133, because they will have both sterile and non-sterile compounding. Also, throughout, you'll see some formatting and grammatical corrections. Moving on to D.1.3 amendments to 291-106 concerning non-resident pharmacies or Class Es. What this and the amendments accomplish is the creation of two new classes of pharmacies, a Class EN, which performs non-sterile compounding, and a Class ESN, which performs both sterile and non-sterile compounding. The requirements of Class E have not changed. And again, these amendments are being suggested based on the recommendation of the board's compounding advisory group. On line 72, requires Class ES pharmacies to comply with the standard required notifications, closing procedures, and pharmacy license fee requirements. Like the rules above, this change makes the rule more concise and keeps us from having to modify the rule every time we have a change. On line 97, it removes the requirements that a Class ES pharmacy engaged in the compounding of non-sterile preparations comply with 291-131. On line 107, you have the licensing requirements for the Class EN, a non-resident pharmacy engaged in compounding of non-sterile preparations that use bulk API or excipients or manipulation beyond the FDA labeling of a commercial product, such as crushing a tablet or opening a capsule. Here again, we see the line in the sand. And they have the same licensing requirements under 291-131 for compounding non-sterile preparations. And finally, line 143 has licensing requirements for Class ESN, a non-resident pharmacy engaged in both the compounding of sterile preparations and non-sterile preparations that use bulk API or excipients or manipulation beyond the FDA labeling of a commercial product, such as crushing a tablet or opening a capsule. The same licensing requirements for 291-131 and 291-133 still apply because they will have both sterile and non-sterile compounding. Also throughout, you will see some formatting and grammatical corrections. Moving to D.1.3.4, these are amendments to 291-131 concerning requirements for pharmacies compounding non-sterile preparations. And again, these amendments were suggested based on the recommendation of the board's compounding advisory group. On line 115, you have the definition of cleaning. On line 141, you have the definition of sanitizing. On lines 160 through 165, requires all pharmacists involved in the preparation and handling of compounded non-sterile preparations to possess the necessary education, training, and proficiency, including 1 hour of ACPE accredited continuing education during each renewal period. On line 166, lists the requirements for pharmacists involved in the preparation and mixing of compounded non-sterile preparations that use bulk API or excipients or manipulation beyond the FDA labeling of a commercial product, such as crushing a tablet or opening a capsule. Here again is the line in the sand, which is the current line in the sand for these new requirements. And those requirements include testing of 3 preparations compounded by the pharmacy for accuracy of correct identities and amounts of ingredients within the first 6 months of engaging in compounding non-sterile preparations for patient use, and to demonstrate and document competency and undergo reevaluation every 12 months. Line 185 requires all technicians and pharmacy technician trainees engaged in non-sterile compounding to have 1 hour of ACPE accredited continuing education during each renewal period. Line 190 lists the requirements of pharmacy technicians and pharmacy technician trainees involved in the preparation and mixing of compounded non-sterile preparations that use bulk API or excipients or manipulation beyond the FDA labeling of a commercial product, which is crushing a tablet or opening a capsule, including testing of 3 preparations compounded by the pharmacist for accuracy of correct identities and amounts of ingredients within the first 6 months of engaging in compounding non-sterile preparations for patient use, and to demonstrate and document competency and undergo reevaluation every 12 months. Moving to line 205, it requires initial training for all personnel involved in the preparation and mixing of compounded non-sterile preparations. The line in the sand for compounding that uses bulk API or excipients or manipulation beyond the FDA labeling of a commercial product, such as crushing a tablet or opening a capsule. And that's through a single 40-hour course for a pharmacy technician, or a 20-hour course for a pharmacist of instruction and hands-on in-person experience. Such training shall be obtained through completion of a recognized course from an accredited college of pharmacy or a course sponsored by an ACPE accredited provider. Or, in the alternative, the initial training could be completed through a structured, on-the-job didactic, hands-on, in-person experiential training program at the pharmacy where the individual is involved in non-sterile compounding. That training, however, is not transferable to another pharmacy unless the pharmacies are under common ownership and control and use a common training program. Line 217 lists the training areas, including hand hygiene, garbing, cleaning and sanitizing, handling and transporting components, and compounded non-sterile preparations, measuring and mixing, proper use of equipment and devices, and documentation of the compounding process. Line 228 requires all training be completed and documented prior to engaging in compounding non-sterile preparations for patient use. And line 230 requires that the experiential portion of the training process must be supervised by an individual actively engaged in performing non-sterile compounding and is qualified and has already completed the specified training outlined in the rule. Line 300, concerning the environment, this amendment requires that space be designated for non-sterile compounding, and it lists some more requirements. Line 326 requires cleaning and sanitizing of the services in the non-sterile compounding area shall occur on a regular basis as defined in the pharmacy's SOPs. Line 331, regarding the equipment and supplies, this amendment removes the TSBP from periodically performing an inspection and instead requires a Class A prescription balance or analytical balance and weights to be inspected and calibrated at least every 12 months by a qualified independent individual, and to have the balance calibrated and the accuracy of the balance verified by the pharmacy on a routine basis as specified in the pharmacy's SOPs. The pharmacy must also document the calibration and verification. Line 349 requires the use of a closed system processing device to reduce the risk of contamination during weighing, measuring, or otherwise manipulating components that generate airborne chemical particles, and provides examples of closed system processing devices. Line 403 requires the pharmacist to establish the purity and stability of each component by obtaining a certificate of analysis from the supplier and ensuring that the component meets the acceptance criteria in a USPNF monograph, if one exists. Line 443 requires hand hygiene procedure when entering the designated compounding area, and gloves and other garb shall be worn for all compounding activities. Garbing requirements shall be determined by the pharmacy and documented in the pharmacy's SOPs. Finally, line 478 requires the pharmacy to develop and implement SOPs for complaint, variance, and adverse event report, receipt, acknowledgement, handling, and documentation. Additionally, you'll see some formatting and grammatical corrections throughout. Board members, we did receive several comments on this rule, specifically 291 and 131. And to summarize, we have 3 comments which support adoption without any changes, 20 comments that are opposed to adoption, and 11 comments that ask the board to change something about the proposed amendments. And we'll go through those now. The board received joint comments on all 4 rules from the Alliance of Pharmacy Compounding and National Community Pharmacists Association in support of the amendments, and comments from Jim Hertzner, pharmacist with Las Colinas Pharmacy, in support of the amendments. The board also received comments on all 4 rules from Kathleen Jackson, a pharmacist, in support of the amendments and suggesting the removal of or the manufacturer's specifications for the smallest weighable quantity from the minimum weight for which a balance may be used. The board also received comments on 291.77 and 291.131 from Houston Methodist in support of some of the amendments, specifically those concerning equipment, supplies, garbing, and SOPs supporting quality assurance, and expressing concern about the remaining amendments, the availability of training resources, whether the number of training hours was warranted, and requesting clarification of the training requirements and the degree of involvement needed to trigger the training requirements, the frequency of testing requirements, the separation required for the designated space requirement, and the pharmacist's role in each of the process checks. The board received comments on all 4 rules from the Texas Pharmacy Association, expressing concern that the amendments are overly prescriptive and will limit or delay patient access to non-sterile compounded preparations. Additional training is unnecessary because pharmacists receive adequate compounding training in school, and the continuing education requirement may become repetitive since guidelines are not changed frequently, and suggesting that if the board has concern for patient safety, they
It should instead enforce its existing rules that require the proficiency necessary to properly and safely perform compounding duties. The board also received comments on 291.36 and 291.131 from the Texas Federation of Drugstores, expressing concern that the amendments will cause some pharmacies to stop providing medications that require non-sterile compounding, which will negatively impact medication access and patient adherence to taking medications. It does not provide meaningful additional information to board inspectors and imposes training, equipment, and testing requirements that are excessively costly and burdensome for the scope and quantity of non-sterile compounding provided by the vast majority of chain retail pharmacies. The board received comments on 291.77 and 291.131 from the Texas Society of Health System Pharmacists, expressing concern that the amendments will impose significant economic costs, leading to an increase in the cost of patient care, especially in rural areas, impose personnel and testing requirements that are excessive and costly, and contains language that conflicts with USP 800, and suggesting clarification of the environment requirements for handling non-sterile, non-hazardous drugs under USP 797, compared with non-sterile hazardous drugs, USP 795. The board also received comments on 291.36 and 291.131 from Dennis Wiesner, a pharmacist expressing concern that the proposed amendments would cause a substantial financial hardship for the typical community pharmacy, leading many pharmacies to opt out of becoming a non-sterile compounding pharmacy, in turn causing hardship to patients who won't be able to go to their community pharmacy for all their non-sterile compounding prescription needs, and requesting clarification on how the amendments align with USP non-sterile compounding definitions and what will be the additional compliance and disciplinary costs to the board to address the new requirements. Additionally, the board received comments on 291.36 and 291.131 from Mark Johnston, a pharmacist with CVS Health, expressing concern that the amendments are costly and will negatively affect patient access to simple non-sterile compounding due to pharmacies ceasing to offer these services, and suggesting the removal of the requirements for testing, training hours, closed system device, and removal of carpeting, and suggesting the guarding requirements be permissive instead of mandatory. The board also received comments on 291.36 and 291.131 from Janu Phillip, pharmacist with Walgreens, expressing concern that the amendments will limit patient access to vital components or vital compounds and are unnecessary for commercially manufactured, ready-to-use products that have not been manipulated, and suggesting certain changes to the education, training, testing, and environment requirements, and to exempt commercially manufactured, ready-to-use products that have not been manipulated if no more than 4 unmanipulated commercially manufactured, ready-to-use products are used. Compounding is not done in anticipation of medication orders. The pharmacy follows USP 795 beyond use dates, and a valid prescription serves as the compounding record. Additionally, the board received comments on 291.36 and 291.131 from Jeff Loesch, a pharmacist with Kroger Health, expressing concern that the amendments will limit access to prescription flavoring, which affects pediatric adherence to taking medication, and to simple compounds such as magic mouthwash used by oncology patients for prompt relief from oral pain, and imposes testing and training requirements that are not adequately specific to pharmacies, varying levels of compounding complexity. The board also received comments on 291.36 and 291.131 from Rob Geddes, PharmD with Albertsons Companies, expressing concern that the amendments will result in delayed patient care and are unnecessary for simple routine compounds, such as magic mouthwash, and may delay patient treatment during a public health crisis as pharmacies wait for waivers to new regulations, and suggesting that the board table the amendments until the USP 795 guidelines have been finalized, or if the board moves forward, add an exemption for simple compounds. The board also received comments on 291.131 from Chad Baker, FlavorX, expressing concern that the amendments will impose costly and time-consuming requirements that will cause pharmacies to stop flavoring services, resulting in less compliance from children and parents trying untested home-cooked methods of flavoring, and suggesting that the addition of flavoring to conventionally manufactured medication be excluded from the amendments if the flavoring agents are therapeutically inert and non-allergenic and do not exceed 5% of the drug product's total volume and produce no effect other than flavor. The board also received comments on 291-131 from Ted Maynard, our pharmacist with Texas Health Resources Infusion Pharmacy, expressing concern that some of the proposed testing, training, and equipment requirements are excessive for non-sterile compounding and unnecessarily pose an administrative and financial burden on the practice of pharmacy. The board also received comments on 291-36 and 291-131 from Leanne Hampton, a pharmacist with Paris Factory, expressing concern that the amendments are unnecessary given the level of training that pharmacists receive and will primarily hinder honest pharmacists rather than stop bad actors. The board also received comments on 291-36 and 291-131 from Craig Chapman, pharmacist with Mabank Family Pharmacy, expressing concern that the amendments will impose costly and unnecessary requirements for compounding common products like Magic Mouthwash and will result in patients mixing the ingredients at home, which is likely to result in a lower quality final product. The board received comments on 291-36 and 291-131 from Thomas Guerrera, a pharmacist, Melissa Klausner, a pharmacist, and Jacob Kolbeth, a pharmacist, all with H.E.B. Pharmacy, expressing concern about the hood and dedicated space requirements given the limited space available in many pharmacies, and suggesting that the definition of compounding exclude flavoring commercially available products and compounding simple products such as Magic Mouthwash, because those services have been done safely and effectively without the additional required training and equipment. The board also received comments on 291-36 and 291-131 from J.D. Fang with Puret's Pharmacy and Adam Baer, pharmacist with Hillcrest Pharmacy, both expressing concern that the continuing education requirements are unnecessary given the education that pharmacists receive in school. Requiring a hood is unnecessary for non-sterile compounding and would burden patients in rural areas who would have to drive long distances to reach a compounding pharmacy. Additionally, the board received comments on 291-36 and 291-131 from Young Lee, pharmacist with H.E.B. Pharmacy, expressing concern that imposing additional requirements on pharmacies engaged in non-sterile compounding could result in delayed patient care for compounds like Magic Mouthwash. The board also received comments on 291-131 from Paul Kitchens, a pharmacist with H.E.B. Pharmacy, expressing concern that requiring a special designation for a pharmacy to flavor liquid products will increase the cost and decrease the availability of flavoring, resulting in patients discontinuing therapy before completion. The board also received comments on 291-36 and 291-131 from Aaron Raber, a pharmacist, Crystal McIntyre, a pharmacist both with Highlands Pharmacy, and Lauren Hayden, a pharmacist with H.E.B. Pharmacy, expressing concern that the amendments are unnecessary given the knowledge and training pharmacists receive in pharmacy school and would burden patients in rural areas who have to drive long distances to reach a compounding pharmacy. The board also received comments on 291-131 from Camille Nagar-Heath, a pharmacist, expressing concern that the cost of sending compounding samples will reduce treatment access by increasing cost to patients, and suggesting that pharmacists with PharmDs be exempt from the additional training and testing requirements. The board also received comments on 291-36 and 291-131 from Thor Trailer, a pharmacist, and Robin Griffith, a pharmacist, both with Brookshire Brothers, expressing concern that the amendments would result in some pharmacies ceasing to offer simple compound products and would unduly burden patients in rural areas who would have to drive long distances to reach a compounding pharmacy. The board also received comments on 291-36 and 291-131 from Sheila Dawson, a pharmacist with Brookshire Brothers, expressing concern that the proposed equipment and dedicated space requirements are unnecessary and that a separate license to perform non-sterile compounding is unwarranted given the knowledge and training pharmacists receive in pharmacy school. The board also received comments on 291-36 and 291-131 from Laura Edmondson, a pharmacist with Brookshire Brothers, requesting clarification of the proposed amendments and expressing concern with the space and equipment requirements, and noting that if pharmacies cease common preparations like Magic Mouthwash, it will greatly limit general public access and burden patients in rural areas who would have to drive long distances to reach a compounding pharmacy, and also suggesting that the amendments clarify that the prescription balance only be required for pharmacies that are compounding products that need to be weighed. The board also received comments on all four rules from Chuck Sin, a pharmacist with H.E.B. Pharmacy, expressing concern that the amendments will negatively affect patients by creating unnecessary barriers to offering compounding services and may result in pharmacies ceasing to offer flavoring and simple compounding services due to the cost and additional training requirements. The board also received comments on 291-36 and 291-131 from Brian Hetler, a pharmacist, expressing concern that the amendments will impact the availability of prescription flavoring, resulting in less compliance from children, particularly children with special needs, and restricts access to simple compounds such as Pink Magic by limiting access to pharmacies with the correct hood and other materials. The board also received comments on 291-36 and 291-131 from Aaron Gibson, a pharmacist with prescription shop, expressing concern that the amendments will not be followed by bad actors and will only make compounding impossible for good actors and will burden patients in rural areas who would have to drive long distances to reach a compounding pharmacy. Finally, the board received comments on 291-77 and 291-131 from A.J. Day, a pharmacist with PCCA, suggesting more specific language regarding the testing requirements, removal of the manufacturer specification for the smallest weighable quantity for the minimum weight for which a balance may be used, and certain technical corrections and clarification of certain terms and phrases. And that is all of the comments.
Thank you so much. Yes, Daniel?
I've got a few questions that whenever you feel as though you've ever been asked.
John or Rose?
I'm not sure to whom, I just questions.
Okay, well, let's start, see where we go and what we need to do at that
I
point.
think my first question might be for Tim. Can you give me a sense of the urgency? What's the sense of urgency on the adoption of these particular items that have been presented?
As it has been explained to me very clearly, this has been a multiple year process. And they have worked very, very hard as a group to bring suggested language. As far as the sense of urgency, in my opinion, the sense of urgency is to adopt appropriate rules and not get in a hurry to do inappropriate rules. So I guess my answer is we would like to have rules, but the urgency is minimal.
Okay, thank you. My second question, one of the comments that was made by our member of the audience mentioned that there were some communication struggles or communication challenges between the subcommittee, I believe she was a part of the subcommittee, and the interpretation of the language that is now being presented to us for consideration and adoption. Are there minutes, reports, or procedure in how that recommendation for the subcommittee is eventually transitioned over to the board and then brought to us for consideration?
I'm gonna ask Megan to answer that question. She was there for those discussions, so I'd rather her answer it than me try to give you my interpretation.
Saw that coming. So yes, Daniel, there are minutes from those groups, and I believe those are available on the website once they've been approved by the group. So there's usually, a meeting delay, the same way the yours are for these types of meetings. Staff put together the, rule language as best they could based on what they're saying. And when I say staff, I'm talking mainly about attorneys. So we have a limited understanding of pharmacy in comparison to the members of those groups, especially, for compounding. We did bring the suggested language, that we put together based on what we thought they were asking for to their meetings for their feedback on it. But I'm not going to say that it's not impossible that we misconstrued something that they were trying to tell us. We did our best to follow what they were saying.
That had kind of been my assumption, that somewhere, something may have been lost in translation as to what the intent versus the, kind of getting into that whole practice and exercise that we went through yesterday on the term shell. How is that seen by one group as opposed to another? I think that, go ahead.
I will say, there wasn't a 100% consensus within the group. So I don't know that anybody was fully in love with the language, because nobody was getting exactly what they wanted. It was a group decision to move forward with what they had.
I think that exhausts all my questions, and
this subcommittee put together? When was this subcommittee put together and why? Was Polly injured or something?
It came from a request from the staff initially, but maybe if you want to give a little bit more history on that.
So that happened at a board meeting. The board created this combating advisory group. I can't remember exactly the origin. I think it was part of the industry and part of police staff. I know the inspectors wanted some guidance, and that was something that we were really looking forward to from this group. I think the group came together a little bit before the pandemic started, but I can't remember the exact meeting. I'd have to go back and look at that.
So
We've seen two from the audience, so maybe 2 years ago.
Yeah, the initial request was because the investigators were looking for some further guidance. And so the task force was put together to see what we could give to the investigators, and then it took another bit of a turn with it. So it's been a progression for the 2 years.
I'd like to thank everybody who braved the traffic to come here to testify today, as well as those who took the time out to put together some comments that you submitted. I would like to just make a few suggested tweaks that I think might make the majority of the people happy in this room. If you can look at the definition of non-sterile compounding. So it would include D.1.3.1, 1.3.2, 1.3.3, and in 1.3.4 in the rules. Wherever it says a community pharmacy engaged in the compounding of non-sterile preparations that use bulk API or excipients or manipulation beyond the FDA labeling of a commercial product, I'd like to insert here that would generate airborne chemical particles, open parentheses, crushing a tablet or opening a capsule, and then insert with the exception of 291.131 D1H. If you look further in those rules on line 286 and you see 291.131 D1H, it's the existing language on flavoring, so which is allowed currently in our regs. So if you list that as an exception, that means that the flavoring is exempted from the definition of non-compounding, or of non-sterile compounding. Adding the verbiage that would generate airborne chemical particles to that one section would eliminate and exclude those of you who do Miracle Mouthwash or anything that's commercially available, ointments, to make doctor rash ointments, oral liquids that would make a magic mouthwash. So given those little tweaks, I think that takes a lot of heat off the table and gives almost everyone a little bit of acceptance, I would think. Any comments?
Donna, Heather?
Yeah, so I think those are good suggestions, but I also think that the consensus of pretty much everybody's comments, that these rules are onerous, and I think yesterday when we all talked about being overly regulated and trying to simplify, and the fact that we have 11 types of licenses today, and now we want to add all these others, I think we're going backwards. I do agree, though, that we do need to have some type of safety regulation, that type of thing. Obviously, compounding is a serious thing, but I think originally the whole issue was we wanted to create a checklist for the inspectors to guide them when they went for an inspection, which is, I think, what they were asking. But I think to Julie's comment, I think we went just a little bit to the extreme, and I think that Jenny's insertions would be great, but I do think that as written today, just overall, it is too onerous. It is not something that we would, that I would support, and I think that it would hinder patient access and create some undue costs, whether it be to the pharmacy, which that's not our deal. We don't, the business of pharmacy is not ours, but the patient safety, being that if a business has and then passes that on to the patient, then that becomes a patient safety access type thing, because now I can't afford to get that medication. So that's just my comments. I would not support this.
Well, I think that, going back to something you said, yesterday when we were doing our training, one of the things that was said is that anytime you impact patient access, it impacts patient safety. And so I think, that was a valid part of our training yesterday.
I'm not finished with my piece.
Okay.
How about the others?
And I will Dallas comments as well.
I don't think that this is a step back at all. We are moving forward with the changes in our practice. Guys, this is $7.95. This is coming, whether we like it or not. It's coming. The majority of it is already here. If our board does not step up and take precautions and put out some basic baby step regs, we are going to continue to see issues here in Texas. There have already been issues in Texas with non-sterile compounding. There has been harm in non-sterile compounding. By removing the flavoring exemption, or adding an exemption for flavoring, adding an exemption for magic mouthwash and doctor appointments, opens it up, reduces those costs to those who don't want to do the powder containment goods. So anything that generates a powder, pulling apart a capsule, crushing a tablet, weighing up, 1 gram of powder from a jar of chemical, exposes cross-contamination possibilities to other preparations in that area, other bottles, other labeling, other things that are in that area that someone could take home with them and have an allergic reaction. That's the whole point of a powder containment good. I could go on and on. A few other tweaks as far as like the training or the testing. I think we should continue on and move forward and with some tweaks and have the staff update a few things, move it forward to a proposed rule for the next board meeting so that we're not tabling it. The conversation doesn't die. Let's make a few tweaks, put it back out there for public comment, and just keep going. I don't think we should table it. We finally have the momentum after 3 years. I think for the safety of the public and in the public's best interest, we need to continue on with this conversation. Some of the other tweaks I think that I would like for staff to look at is on the testing aspect, where it says within the first 6 months. I think that should be stretched out to maybe 12 months. We'll see what kind of feedback we get back on that. I wanted to bring up that on the training, at the end of line 212, there's the section about 40 hours of coursework of 40 hours or 20 hours for the pharmacist. That at the end of that sentence is an or. It's not an and. So they can send someone off to a class for the training, or they can do in-house training, which is much, much cheaper than sending someone off to a 40-hour class. On the scales, I agree with a couple of comments that both AJ Day and Kathy Jackson posted. And the actual weighable quantity of a balance, it needs to stop at balance and scratched out the remainder of that line, being scratched for the manufacturer specification for the smallest weighable quantity. For powder containment goods, as far as being certified every 12 months, I think we should scratch by a qualified independent individual. That's line 357. And add in compliance with manufacturer's recommendation. In the section on hand washing, which is line 443, it's a little wordy. I think we should just limit it to personnel engaged in compounding shall perform hand hygiene or hand washing procedures when entering the designated compounding area, and scratch the remainder of that verbiage down through line 448. Yeah, I think we should move forward with some tweaks, have staff wordsmith it, and then bring it back for yet more discussion for public comment.
So I still want to bring up a question from our last meeting, because I do think that, and then I'm going to ask Megan for some guidance for us. So one of the things that, I still kind of go back to, and I look at, 30 plus years of being a pharmacist, and I look at where we are right now pandemic-wise, and I don't know why, but it keeps coming back to, if we were ever in a position where something is not commercially available, and I go back to the days where Tamiflu was in short supply, and we needed pharmacists, to compound Tamiflu, are we tying our hands too far?
No, because the board can do an emergency rule, just like we did for this pandemic with regard to,
But how long does that take?
how long did it take us? It was 2 days?
Well, you look at Louisiana's hurricane, and there's a number of weeks that were there that people were delayed, so I worry about that. So, I want to make sure that we at least think that through, because I do not want to be in a position where we have an epidemic or something going on, and we're not being able to take care of the.
Well, I agree with that, thinking that I personally don't want to be in a situation where the board is sued for lack of protecting the public due to enacting basic rules.
So with that, are there other questions, comments? Because I do want to make sure that I want Megan to kind of give us a little bit of advice, I'll say. Donnie?
Yes, Jenny, I had a question for you. I made notes during all the comments, and I had the very same ones. If you excluded magic mouthwash and the flavorings, 90% of our pharmacies in the state do those or more, but they don't do a lot of them do not do any other compounding other than those two things, and maybe a cream or two, but they don't. So I like that idea. On page 213, or line 213, I have a note about that. Just a moment. 213. It had to do with the education part, and I'm glad you brought up about the or section, because institutions that I'm involved with, we have hands-on training, and that generally will satisfy whatever training requirement we have. Is that right? Is that what you do that on your own, in your facility? Do you train?
I train them first, and so they know what they're doing, and then if they're gonna stick around, I'll send them to a class
Okay.
to enhance that training.
Okay, but I do like the idea of proceeding, maybe tweaking, wording, whatever, but not drop the ball here. But I do like the excluding of those two compounds, because that literally does, or however we want to reword
Right,
that.
right.
So why don't we do this? Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'll be quick with it. Thank you.
You're good.
Is that on your blind side?
Yeah.
I think as I read the rules that were presented, there are some very excellent best practices here. I mean, that pharmacists should probably want to do in general, right? I mean, there are some very good training, testing, education, and so forth. So I do think that's the case. I was thinking back to our last board meeting. I kind of felt like this came on our lap pretty quick. I didn't remember seeing a report being produced. I know we have minutes from meetings. Would have been helpful to have had meetings, a report of some sort, so that we could try to be better prepared, so we don't have to tweak the rules like this. We're voting for fine proposal, we already voted on this once already. Now we're doing a tweak again, because I felt like the last time we got rushed in really quick. Just an observation. Just the process I thought was rushed at the end, but, I felt that was difficult, but, I think when it comes down to it, adding all these complexities in the rules, different classes of pharmacies is not what we want to go down, in my opinion. It just adds more work. And I think the original intent, if I hear it correctly, was to provide a checklist or support for inspectors. And I don't really see a checklist here at all. Yes, the rules are here, but some kind of a condensed, like pager or something would have been really good for them to have, versus having to thumb through all the rules that we might pass. So I really would have hoped that would have been more of the end point of that, support. I think we have good rules, some just have to be enforced. So just wanted to say that, because I thought that we went to the point where it's like really hard for our pharmacists are going to have a hard time understanding all the complexity. And then of course, like the CE component, there's not a lot of CEs for non-sterile. I mean, that would be nice, but
like to move forward with that now, you would vote to withdraw the proposed rules and then direct staff to bring the rules and the comments that were received and heard here today, including those of the board members, back to the compounding advisory group for their consideration and updated suggestions. So that's an option that's available to you that would move things forward without making any final decisions today. You also have the option to withdraw the rules and take no further action.
May I just ask one bit of clarification on your option one?
Yes.
If we were to take that route, does that mean that it's more just a continuation but not an adoption?
It would not be an adoption, so you would withdraw.
Draw.
You would make a motion to withdraw, and then you would direct staff to complete those tasks of making the updates, meeting the compounding advisory group. The reason you'd want to withdraw is because you don't want that proposal hanging out there in the register. It would prevent us from being able to do anything else with these rules if we needed to within the next 6 months. So that second option is to withdraw the rules and take no further action, which it does not sound like you want to do, but that is an option that's available to you. There's also an option to withdraw the rules and then re-propose with revisions that you come up with here today. I think that would be very difficult, but it's an option that's available to you. And then there's always the option to adopt these as they are here today.
Yes, sir.
If I can just point out as well, option 3 that you referenced, during our presentation yesterday, during our training session, one of the lessons that really stuck out to me was the bullet point that said wordsmithing in public is not advised. And I really feel like that's kind of where we're at. And so unless there's, at some point, I'm interested in making a motion that would allow us to move forward, but not to the point where we're trying to make a quick decision on wordsmithing here.
Yes, sir.
And how would we make a suggestion to the staff or to the advisory committee if we wanted to, introduce some additional clarifications on, excluding these 2 things or 3 things, whatever we come up with? How, would that be number 3? Would that be what you think would not be good, or would we just do 1 with additions, or how would you do that?
I think that would be option number 1, where we have them also consider what the board will be meeting minutes of this. There's also a live stream recording, so we could even, replay this part if they wanted to listen to that again. We also have several staff members here taking very detailed notes, so we will be able to get that to them in writing as well.
Okay, all right, that's very good, thank you.
Dan,
Whenever you're ready, I'm ready to make a motion.
is there any more discussion? Seeing none,
I'd like to make a motion to withdraw the current proposal, and as opposed to this being sent back to the subcommittee, though, I'd like for it to go back to our staff for review and for, if Tim, I know that the, kind of diverting a little off my motion, so don't worry about that, but I recognize that as we get a little closer and closer to the end of the year, the calendar becomes much more complex, especially as we're moving towards our first meeting in 2022 being in early February. With that said, I think it would be worthwhile, one of the conditions of my motion, to include some type of workshop with the board and with the staff to make sure that the language that is intended to be a part of this move forward. So I'm asking for a motion to withdraw this, but for what's been presented thus far, to be reviewed by our staff.
Can I ask for a clarification on what you mean by workshop?
What do I mean by workshop?
I mean, I believe you said workshop with the staff and the board. Are you meaning another meeting?
Yes, but I recognize as well that we're getting closer and closer to the end of the year, which makes things much more difficult. So if, Tim, if you say, yeah, that's gonna be really hard, then I'll stick with my motion of having at least a withdrawal, but brought back to staff.
Yes, that's gonna be really, really hard.
Okay.
We can evaluate. I would love for your motion to be withdrawal and send to staff for appropriate action.
That's my
Because
motion.
that way we can do what we need to do. If it's send right back to the advisory group, if it's look at a work group, let us evaluate what our options are. But I think that's an appropriate motion unless Megan tells me no.
Is that what you're meaning, Daniel, that we
I'm
could
fine
make a
with that.
determination? Okay.
okay, so
That's my motion.
we do have a motion on the floor. do we have a second to that motion? I've got Lori and Keith seconding. So with that, we'll go ahead and take a vote.
Is that one, are we talking about?
Yes.
Is that one?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and we are going to resume this conversation, as you said, be played to the staff again.
Yes.
And then comments that Jenny said, whoever said, they'll be in consideration, what comes next.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
That's what Daniel was saying, is that we would withdraw the proposed rules, and then it would go back to staff, and staff would review all of the comments and everything that happened here today, and everything everyone said, and then make a determination of how to move forward with these, whether that be a work group, or going back to the compounding advisory group, or doing something other within the staff, so that we have something for you in February, hopefully.
Just feel like a shorter line of communication back to us kind of assists in alleviating some of those things that are lost in translation.
Well, I like all the comments that have been made, so that's a great strategy.
Okay, so at this point, we do have a motion and a second, and we'll need to take a vote. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion passes.
Question your turn.
Out of order.
That's worth a try.
Out of order, out of order. All right, John, I'm gonna turn it back to you. We have proposed rules.
All right. We're looking at D.2, this is a rules of proposal, and D.2.1. These are amendments concerning 283.4 regarding the extended internship requirements. And essentially what this requires is that a resident in a residency program apply for an extended internship must not have previously failed the NAPLEX or Texas Pharmacy Jurisprudence examination. And this change is being brought to close a loophole that was originally not foreseen. On line 153, to be designated an extended intern of that program, one of the requirements is that one can be a resident in a residency program accredited by the American Society of Health System Pharmacists in the state of Texas. And the amendment adds that one must also not have previously failed the NAPLEX or Texas Pharmacy Jurisprudence examination.
Do we have any discussion on this proposed rule? I have a motion that, Donnie's made a motion that we approve this proposed rule. Second? Daniel Guerrero has made a second. So we need a vote to oppose this rule. All those in favor, aye. Any opposed? The motion then carries.
And next, we're going to look at D.2.2. These are amendments relating to 291.29 concerning the professional responsibility of a pharmacist. And these amendments are being proposed in part due to the requirement of House Bill 2056 from this legislative session that requires rules be adopted regarding prescriptions issued as a result of teledentistry. Logically, it follows that prescriptions issued as a result of telemedicine medical services be subject to the same standard. And so on line 128, the validity of a prescription issued as a result of telemedicine's medical services or teledentistry is determined by the same standards that would apply to a prescription issued in an in-person setting. And on lines 131 through 136, it sets the requirements for a valid prescription issued as a result of telemedicine or teledentistry. And first, that it must be issued for a legitimate medical purpose by a practitioner as part of a practitioner-patient relationship, as set out in the Texas Occupations Code, section 111.005, which defines that relationship. And secondly, the prescription must meet all other applicable laws before prescribing, dispensing, delivering, or administering a dangerous drug or controlled substance.
All background to give us, or?
I do not, it's just as I said, this is part of House Bill 2056. So we're being mandated to adopt these rules in coordination with the Texas Dental Board.
My guess would be that you called in and you've got something going on, and they give you a prescription prior to being seen.
I just didn't know if you could see a root canal from it.
Yeah, I don't think it's quite that detailed. All right, this does follow the House bill, so do we have a motion to propose? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Sorry, I was looking at Rick.
Do we have to create a whole new rule, or can it just be inserted into our general rule of, full prescription, and it needs to follow the habit of the list and all that?
And my understanding is we're supposed to adopt new rules in coordination with the Dental Board. I don't know if that would mean necessarily that we would amend other rules in coordination with that.
So this adds an additional subsection to an existing rule, so it is going into the professional responsibility of pharmacists. And we did have to wordsmith language with the dental board, so there was coordination there, and this wording mirrors exactly what's in there, which is what the hospital directed us to do. I think if we tried to squish it in somewhere else, we wouldn't be able to mirror that wording the way that they directed us to.
I just keep going back to that we keep that in more words, and instead of taking away words.
I believe that Mr. Fernandez has made a motion for us to propose, and Mr. Tisch has seconded it. All those in favor of this proposal?
Aye.
Any opposed?
All right, moving on to D.2.3. These are amendments relating to 291.34. It's concerning records of Schedule II controlled substances. On line 89, what you're going to see is that it amends the deadline to the 30th day for dispensing a prescription drug order for a Schedule II controlled substance. And this is being done to be consistent throughout our rules and with federal law, as the rule had previously been 21 days. On line 258, we're updating a reference to the Texas Administrative Code regarding how prescription drug orders may be utilized. And what it does is it references a Health and Human Services rule regarding nursing facility requirements for licensure and Medicaid certification.
All right, do we have a motion to propose? Donnie Lewis has made a motion to propose, Rick has seconded. All those in favor of this proposed rule, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion carries. All right, Sean?
Next, Madam President, we're going to move on to our rule review, which is under D.3. Under that, you'll see our rule review plan, fiscal year 2022 through fiscal year 2025 for review and approval. And state law requires that you as a board review the rules on a 4-year cycle. The last time we completed the rule review plan, it was for fiscal year 2018 through fiscal year 2021, and that was at the February board meeting. What state law requires here is that you review the rules on a 4-year cycle. And what you are looking for is to see if you need these rules, if they're still necessary. It's not about the content of them. So that's the question you're being asked. Now, in D.3.1.1, we have Chapter 291 concerning pharmacies, nuclear pharmacy, Class Bs. We also have D.3.1.2, Chapter 305 concerning educational requirements. And finally, D.3.1.3 concerning Chapter 309 concerning generic substitution. These are the three that are up for review.
All right, so in regards to Chapter 305, there were some comments that came from staff as to whether or not these were duplicative or if they were needed. So I'm going to ask Megan to kind of walk us through that, those comments.
Sure. So there is a suggestion from staff that there may not be a need for Chapter 305, and that the board could propose to withdraw this chapter. So when you're looking at 305.1, sections 558.051 and 558.101 require professional practice degree to be defined in rule. And I'm assuming that that is why this is there. However, in looking at sections 283.2 and 283.3 of the rules, those seem to meet the requirement of defining a professional practice degree in our licensing requirements. And so for that reason, 305.1 is arguably duplicative. And then in 305.2, section 554.053 requires the board to issue standards for recognition of training programs, but it does not require this to be defined in rule. The agency currently does not do everything that is contained in this rule and does not currently have the resources to perform what is included in this rule. So it would be up to you to determine whether or not this one is still needed.
So is it the whole D.1.3 that we would say is not needed?
It would be D.3.1.2, and this would be a proposal, so it would still go through a comment period. So if there's something that we overlooked here today, the public would have an ability to point that out to us before there was an adoption of the withdrawal.
So do we need a motion to withdraw D.3.1.2?
Yes, so normally when we do these,
Normally we do them in bulk.
we do them in bulk, and it's, just proposed to keep. In this one, we would, be looking at D.3.1.1 and D.3.1.3 for potentially keeping, and then potentially D.3.1.2 withdrawn.
So it's two separate actions.
I'd like to motion that we withdraw D.3.1.2. Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor of the withdrawal of D.3.1.2, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, and now back to the business of D.3.1.1 and D.3.1.3. That was a lot of them.
I'll make your motion, we send those proposals in, so I'll make that motion.
So the motion's been made that these are still necessary. Is there a second on that? Lori Hickey has made that second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right. Okay. Just want to make sure we were good on time. All right. Thank you, John. That was quite a feat to get through all of those letters and everything. We appreciate everything that you and the staff have done for that.
You're very welcome.
Not here till Friday. Yeah, no tickets out from the market. Okay, then we're in good shape. All right, with that, next on our agenda is the discussion of possible actions concerning reports, committees, and task force. And with that, I will turn it over to Tim.
Very good, thank you very much. Compounding Advisory Group met on October the 8th, and we had a great meeting that day. It was a little shorter than I think we thought it would be, but we had good participation. I do apologize that we did not realize that was NCPA, and we will try to do better in the future to not put anything on major conventions like NCPA or APHA or ASHP or other things. One thing that the board asked this group to talk about and consider was how we dealt with hormone pellet compounding process and terminal sterilization process by a third-party provider. The advisory group did hear and have lots of discussion about this topic. We had a Colorado pharmacist before us that talked about his process, and the advisory group recommends to the board that you continue as is doing the process with no changes. And then Monitoring Program Advisory Committee, which is, by law, we have to have this group meet. So our next meeting is November the 17th, it's on a Wednesday. We look forward to that group meeting together to talk about where we are on the prescription monitoring program.
All right. Thank you for those reports. Next on our agenda, I'm going to turn it over to Ann so that we can have a financial update.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, board members. Behind in F.1.1, first slide, you'll find the summary data of the financial operations of our agency from September 1st, 2020 through August 31st, 2021. We were appropriated $10.5 million in AY 2021 by the legislature, and through the end of the fourth quarter, we spent $9.2 million, 94% of our annual budget. On the second slide, you will see how all the expenses are broken down into the various legislative budget board categories. In F.1.2, you'll see the travel budget for our board members. Because of COVID, no travel has taken place. In F.1.3, material changes to the contracts for goods and services, we like to inform the board that we have 8 contract extensions to amend the contract term to August 31st, 2022 and August 31st, 2023. We have 1 new contract for case review and expert witness, bringing the new amended contract cost to $13,800. There is no set term for that contract, and the contract is considered complete when all the work is done. This concludes the presentation from finance. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Are there any questions for Ann? Seeing none, Ann, well, thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you for your time.
All right. Yeah. So we're going to skip on the agenda down to F.3, and I'll ask Tim to kind of talk through strategic plan.
In your information that you were sent, you have the responses to our strategic plan survey in that number. We got several responses, and we are in the process of looking at those and planning for the future. But if you have any comments on that, we would welcome those at this time.
Do you want to go through kind of what the calendar looks like? Or?
As you can see on the timeline that you have in front of you, we're talking about them today, and then we will draft a report in December and January and bring you back items for you to discuss at the February meeting. And then the final strategic plan and the LAR will be developed between February and April. And then in May of 2022, you will review and approve the strategic plan and the LAR for the 2024-2025 fiscal year. I'm learning a lot about LAR and LBB and TSBP and all those things. So y'all bear with me as we learn together.
All right, and then we're going to skip down to F.5, and you can give us a report on the prescription monitoring program.
You have the report that's we do in concert with UT. We have a one-page report. It's exciting and shows the number of who all registered. We have 88.7% of our pharmacists that are registered with the PMP. We have 69.1% of our physicians, MDs, MDOs that are registered. 66.2% of our dentists. We had 35,047,115 controlled substances dispensed in fiscal year 2021. I guess one number we're not happy about, hydrocodone was 4,623,777. We are interested to continue to watch these numbers and how they're reported with the changes that happened with PMP as of the 1st of September. So stay tuned, and we'll watch these numbers as with the integration and the NARCS care that went away for funding reasons. Would welcome any comments or questions about PMP.
Any comments or questions from the board? Appreciate all of the staff's work, continued work on PMP. With that, we'll go to F.6, and Megan, can you give us a report on the fields?
Sure. So first, we have the Garrett appeal, and you've heard about this one for the past couple of years. This is the case where two physicians sued TSBP and TMB regarding the prohibition from physicians dispensing from office practices. There was a favorable ruling from a district court that dismissed the case, but the plaintiffs appealed to the Third Court of Appeals in Austin. An attorney from the Office of the Attorney General's Solicitor General's Office has been appointed to handle this case for the board. The briefs were filed in July and August, and the court decided not to conduct oral arguments, so the appeal will be decided upon these briefs. And we have CVS Pharmacy number 7816, and you've heard about this one at the last two board meetings. They have appealed the board order that was entered as a result of the hearing that was held at the State Office of Administrative Hearings, and then your adoption of a proposed order at the February board meeting. The case has been assigned to the 53rd District Court in Travis County. An attorney from the Attorney General's Office has been appointed to handle this case for the board. The opposing counsel has filed their brief, and the Assistant Attorney General has filed our response brief today. And then we have Whole Women's Health, and you've heard about this one at the last board meeting. It is regarding Senate Bill 8, which you may have also heard referred to in the news as the fetal heartbeat bill. The plaintiffs are Texas abortion providers and individuals and organizations who help patients obtain abortions. And they are suing the executive directors of the Texas Medical Board, Texas Board of Nursing, and Texas Pharmacy Board, along with the executive commissioner of the Texas Health and Human Services Commission and the Texas Attorney General. Attorneys from the Attorney General's Office and Office of the Solicitor General have been appointed to handle this case for TSBP and the rest of the defendants. The Office of the Solicitor General is handling the Fifth Circuit and Supreme Court matters at this time. Briefs have been filed in the Fifth Circuit, and oral argument was tentatively set for the week of December 6th in New Orleans. Plaintiffs requested emergency relief from the United States Supreme Court. On October 22nd, the Supreme Court granted certiorari before judgment was made in the district court, and briefs were due last week, and oral arguments were held yesterday. And then we have Light Care RX LLC, and this is another one that you heard about at the last board meeting. The case is in federal district court. This pharmacy had an IC in March regarding an alleged failure to operate and chose not to enter into the proposed agreed court order from the informal conference. Board staff filed and served notice of a hearing at the State Office of Administrative Hearings. This lawsuit alleges that the failure to operate rule is unconstitutional and discriminates against those in heat zone areas. And an attorney from the Attorney General's Office has been appointed to handle this case, and a motion to dismiss was filed on October 26th. And then lastly, we have CVS number 8336. And this is an appeal of a board order that was entered as a result of the hearing that was held at the State Office of Administrative Hearings, and then your adoption of the proposed order at the May board meeting. This case is in the 455th District Court in Travis County, and the judge has not yet been assigned. There is an attorney from the Attorney General's Office who has been appointed to handle this case on behalf of the court.
Thank you, Megan. All right, continue with the agenda. Are there any questions for Megan I should ask first? Tim, if you'll take us through F7, which is the update on legislation passed.
Absolutely. Considering that you passed D.2.2, that was our last item from the 87th legislative session, so our tele-administrator was passed today, and that finishes up all of our requirements to be in compliance with 87 legislative session.
And if you'll go ahead and take us through the FDA MOU.
I will. FDA MOU, this is not a uncommon topic for anyone in the room, but board members, you requested that staff send a letter requesting an extension at the last meeting, and we sent that letter, and we have gotten confirmation that they received our letter. They also have gone on record stating that with the latest court ruling, that they are considering other options. So stay tuned as we move forward to see exactly what's going to happen with the FDA MOU. Anything else we need to cover on that? Okay. That's FDA MOU.
All right. Any questions? And with that, I'm going to ask Ann Driscoll to come forward. I think she's in the room. All right, we'll let her come over. She's going to give us an update on the agency move. Quiet. My guess is the Commission on State Emergency Communications.
Is that what it says? You won't miss it. So, do y'all remember the movie Clue with Tim Curry? There's a scene. Oh, here. Okay. Never mind. I'll tell a story later.
All right.
Sorry, there's about a minute delay in the live stream,
No,
so
no worry, Ann, no worry.
by the time I got that y'all were calling me, I've been sitting here for a little while. Sorry, of course my computer just chose this moment to time out. So the move, you have on F.9 an update on the information that we've been given that we can share as public. All of this information is available on the link that's part of the handout that you've been given. It's on page 2 to the TFC website. Included in that document are some screenshots from beginning to October 25th, which is the last picture. They have finished the outside. They have done interior up to about the 4th level. Obviously, we're on the 13th level, so they have not reached us yet. We don't have a whole lot of information. They're doing this agency by agency. They have not reached our agency yet. We're still working on some electronic schematics and locks on the doors and security. One interesting point is that in front of the building, between the Bullock and us, is going to be a mall where staff, general public can walk, and they may have food trucks, but you can put a Nimitz class air carrier in that space. So it's a very large amount of space that staff will have to sit outside and de-stress if they want, or whichever. But that is about all I have. If y'all have any questions. And we've been told anytime between June and September.
So what is underneath, between the bottle and the?
There'll be parking underneath that.
Okay.
There's-
There's another, and what the slides, was that some different offices or?
There's subterranean parking below both the Congress, between the buildings and the building itself for that building. Cool. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ann. We look forward to getting into that building. We've got a couple of things that we're waiting on people, so that's why we've skipped a little bit. So the next on the agenda is the F.1. I didn't prep prep Rick on this, but I'll ask him to tag team in, should there be something. So Rick Fernandez and I just did complete a NABP task force meeting on medication safety. It was 2 days well spent in Chicago. Part of it was looking at a concept called just culture, and we had a company called Just Culture come and speak with us, as well as several individuals that look at medication safety. One of the things that was looked at was the process by which board members or boards in general think through an error. How does root cause analysis, what does that look like? How should that play a role? Some algorithms. And so NABP will be looking at what tools they can bring back to boards so that boards will have additional, not only ways to look at, a complaint process, but also is there CE, the importance of peer review, some of the other tools that maybe we already use, but other states don't, and the tools that they have that we'll be able to bring into our repertoire. So I'll ask for additional comments or.
No formal comments. No, it was a great opportunity, Julie, to go with you and represent the board there and to learn these concepts of how we talk through errors and how we treat them and how we view them. I think it adjusts our board perspective potentially from a blame kind of a culture that you talked about, to more like a collaborative kind of culture that invites the public to talk about errors differently and not be punitive and have a little more discussion on how to treat like human error versus risk and things like that. So it was a very, very good couple of days that we got to spend out there, and I encourage the other members of the board to participate. We spoke yesterday in other task forces with NABP. I think represents our state, plus the learning networks and other people across the country. So for education, thanks for letting me go.
Yeah, we're waiting on our minutes to come back on that, but I think it'll be really something that the NABP staff gives us additional tools. And as Rick said, and we talked about yesterday in our annual training, any opportunity you have to additionally serve with NABP is definitely worth your time and effort, and it really enhances the strength of our board, as well as the strength of NABP. We're smarter and stronger when we're all working together collaboratively. Caroline, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to go through G for us, and then we'll go ahead and break for lunch. Oh, yes, I should note that Tim is already assigned to the task force on workplace environment, so we'll have another report coming back on that. Thank you for reminding me. Caroline, I'll turn it over to you.
Right, well, looking at G.1, the chart behind G.1 is the report on complaints closed in the fourth quarter of fiscal year 21. That was June through August, end of August 2021. And it also provides the completed FY 21 total complaints closed. So for fourth quarter, there were 1,674 complaints resolved, and that brought your total for complaints resolved in fiscal year 21 to 6,070 complaints. The bottom chart of the page is a summary of those complaints closed in the fiscal year with disciplinary action versus disposition that did not result in disciplinary action against the license. The top chart details the method of closure in each category of closed with discipline and those closed without discipline. It also includes on the top chart referrals to other agencies and also complaints closed with no action. The second page of G.1 is the same information regarding the fourth quarter of fiscal year 21 numbers, but it does compare that with the quarterly average for the prior fiscal year 20, and in a comparison
the actions regarding pharmacy that are closed, it's gone down in the last quarter. They were pretty significant the previous quarter. I think the first page says 108 third quarter and then down to 72. Do you think we're going to see less of those now with some of the actions that we've changed? We spent quite a bit of time discussing more pharmacies that were not operating until they had licenses. Do you think that will be continuing to trend down?
Well, it's hard to tell, Rick. I would like to think that the efforts that staff has been making to kind of thwart, the pharmacies from beginning, closing voluntarily without a, result in those, getting the message out there. If it does result in a complaint being open, then that is what you're seeing here. And it's interesting how it tracks similarly to the second quarter. The numbers are almost identical from the fourth quarter.
Caroline, would you say that maybe that number might go up because we've gotten a little more aggressive on payer of operate cases? And so that number going up may not be a negative? Is that a fair?
I think that would be the idea with that, it'd be positive to have more closures in general.
It's up the board to realize if that number goes up, we've gotten a little more aggressive on the failure to operate cases. And so if we do that appropriately, that number may go up, but don't think that's a negative. That can be a real positive because we've issued license and then they're not operating.
My point would have been like, okay, it's not happening as often as it was. That's what else we need to do. It's people have not opened up.
Hopefully they're closing prior to the board's staff's knowledge. If they get into it and will close voluntarily, that's not reflected here. This would be a closure based on a complaint. So we're hopeful that you'll continue to see that downward trend on the number of complaints closed regarding, because the pharmacy closed.
Quick question, on chart one, looks like there's, it states 11% increase in complaints received. What increase, what was, if you were to define why, was there a reason?
I'm gonna go with the reason we hear a lot, Rick, because of COVID, right? I think in FY20, there was just less consumer movement, but in 2021, so this started with the beginning of September 20 and through August. Again, there was an increase of complaints, in my opinion, due to increased patients needing to go to a pharmacy and then of course experiencing an issue at the pharmacy. I think it was just a result of COVID.
I think anecdotally that is a correct answer. I think that for those of us that maybe work in retail, we see shorter fuses. Pharmacies are busy right now with additional workload of immunizations, and so you may see more complaints because they had to wait a little bit longer, or
They're not really warranted, but just frustrating.
yes.
I think that is somewhat reflected in the chart on the first page under no action. You can see an increase there of complaints we have received that we've just, based on thorough review of those complaints, unfortunately, doesn't result in a violation. Yeah, so we'll look now at your open complaints. So this is G.2. Chart 1 provides the end of the fiscal year 21 totals for complaints received, closed, and the average time to resolve complaints with comparison for each of the prior fiscal years within. Also providing historical information for the last 4 fiscal years. And then the second chart is your report on open complaints by age. And as of October 11th, 2021, there were 1,358 open complaints pending with the pharmacy board. That concludes staff's charts of your closed and open complaints.
As we're closing
You look at the FY reflected in the chart. Any other questions for Ms. Carolyn? All right. With that, it's a good break, good time to break as far as where we are with the agenda. At this time, we'll go ahead and break, and if we can come back at 12:45.